Hi everyone, my name's Rob Moffat. I work for FINOS, which is part of the Linux Foundation, and FDC3 is a project which we steward it within FINOS.
We looked at the process of handling a client voice RFQ, and theoretically there's about 22 things that someone should check internally, whether it's reg or commercial imperatives. Things like, is the client fully documented, are they fully onboarded, credit worthiness, any red flags, etc., etc. Everyone else has kind of made the case for the need for contextually aware desktop and interoperability across the various applications that would provide these kind of 22 bits of data. I think specifically on how it changes, or the potential for change, the dynamic between sell side and buy side. One of the reasons we've used FDC3 as a pattern for getting that interoperability working is to also retain optionality to land some of those components on the client desktop. So there's plenty of those components, those nuggets of data that should theoretically be useful to the buy side. So, for example, blottering the last tenant requests that happened in the relevant asset class. Those small nuggets of data should be applicable on the buy side. And I think, for NatWest, we've got a good single dealer platform, Agile Markets. It would be unreasonable, I think, to expect someone like Rowe Price to adopt that as an all-encompassing single container solution. So the only show in town really to get some of those components, some of those nuggets of data into client-side workflow is to use a non-proprietary standard. So in promoting FDC3 internally, we solve that interoperability pattern, but hopefully we also retain that optionality to land useful functional components and data on the client desktop in a very low friction way. That means you don't need to code to our standards.
I mean, so in my previous experience, like working in Deutsche Bank with the Autobahn team, we're building these massive desktops where everything's tightly integrated. But I think FDC3 sort of changes that dynamic, doesn't it? Can you talk to how that might affect the way you publish apps and deliver apps to the likes of Nick?
Yeah, I've also been in a tier one bank trying to convince everyone to install the single dealer, operate within the single container. I think for NatWest, NatWest isn't a tier one bank, and we're very honest about that. There's areas of specialism, of product focus, geographical focus, client focus, where we really try and focus our efforts. So that means, again, it would be unreasonable to expect someone to bring up our container and live in our container for a significant part of the day. So yeah, that's like coming to that point of realization. It's all about kind of lowering the barrier to entry to our services, making sure that we get this optionality to put our single dealer, parts of our single dealer into a client workflow. I think particularly in financial institutions, NatWest has a very strong corporate franchise, particularly in the UK, where you can expect maybe less vendor and proprietary tech on the desktop as a rule. But financial institutions, for someone like NatWest, if you want your single dealer to continue to be relevant, you need to break it down and componentize it and allow it to be used at the right point in the workflow. I think I mentioned this when we spoke, Rob. I spoke to a client fairly recently who had an API first strategy, and I showed some of the functionality in our single dealer platform. There's a component called the Gamma Hedger that's fairly involved, fairly functionally rich. And when he looked at that component, he said, okay, right, so I don't really see myself taking this in an API and building this functionality, this fully featured functionality on the desktop. Maybe if you could componentize it and get that to live in my desktop more seamlessly, I would take that component of your single dealer, as long as I don't have to bring your container up and it works within my framework. So I think that's that's a very good example for us and this was a very big financial institution client where traditionally people think it's difficult to sell single dealers into financial institutions because of things like best execution requirements, or at least a perception of having to operate in a multi-dealer environment. But here you've made that delivery more feasible.
It's really encouraging to hear, having been involved for years and years. We saw a lot more uptake just inside sell-side institutions. They were the early adopters. Many of them speak here, Citi, NatWest, JP Morgan, others, and they used it in-house just for that architectural benefit. You loosely coupled the components, they weren't welded into the monolith that could only be updated every 6 months with everybody involved. It was lots of little micro front ends. The promise was always, though, that it would build the relationships between different organisations, that we'd have the vendor apps dropping into that space. I think it's fair to say for the first few years of FDC3 that didn't come about as much. There were a handful of fintechs adopting it, but where it's really going to realise its potential is realising its potential is as we start getting the integrations between buy and sell sides that we've been seeing the last 2 or 3 years. They've been driving new things. There are new demands for FDC3. There was the need to put it into web browsers. There's now need to do things with identity for apps to be able to ensure they're talking to other ones that their team has approved them to talk to. There's interesting stuff to do in onboarding as well, which I think we'll come to in a little bit.
I'm going to turn it over to the audience in a minute for questions, but I just wanted to kind of pick up on that last point that you've made, because it seems like FDC3 has been on this journey from being, in one company on one desktop to being across the web, desktops, whatever, across multiple companies, multiple apps, a really heterogeneous environment. So Chris, can you kind of just fill us in on a bit of that evolution and what's been happening in FDC3 to get us there and make that happen, and what we can look forward to?
Obviously it started with the design, 2017, 2018? It's been a few years now, it's like 6-7 years. It's obviously been refined gradually, particularly by those sell-side users and requests that they've had to be able to do things. The last year we spent a lot of time bringing it into web browsers. Vendors, particularly Interop.io, were already there. Glue42 Core a few years ago was working in a web browser, was able to integrate disparate apps with each other, but it's taken a lot of work. I think it's taken up a lot of the last year and a half for Rob and myself and a few others to make that completely vendor agnostic, so you can just incorporate the FDC3 library and it will connect to any desktop agent that's deployed in the browser. With that, we've had to write a wire protocol for it, something it's never had. It's always been just a design for an API. We've had to flesh out some of the machinery underneath in order to do those new things. So that vendor agnosticism will probably start to come to the other adapters like .NET and Java. It'll be more possible to trade those applications because of the wire format. But the thing now is people are starting to release their platforms, lots more smaller applications that they want to put out elsewhere. So the big topic of conversation at the moment is identity management. The apps being able to identify each other and the apps being able to identify the users in an easy way. You said one of the first questions you ask is, do you have FDC3 and SSO? And the SSO question is difficult in finance. It's one of the more difficult integrations to do, is my understanding. So it's something we're talking about in FDC3 to try and make easier. Well, there's probably a few different use cases. There's the full onboarding, but Matt, I think you described really well some of the onboarding cases we have where you could start to show people what you can do once you get the app on the desktop.
Yeah, I think I think it's a bit of a continuum where at one end you've got SSO fully authenticated, and then at the other end you've got a tacit level of identity. And I think one of the car crashes with this pattern if you like, or the potential for a car crash is you've enabled this brilliantly interoperable environment using this non-proprietary standard, and then the client hits a process break, a brick wall, where even for the most basic functionality, they have to then fill something out to identify themselves or fully authenticate for something that in reality doesn't require that level of identity management. So yeah, I think for me, utopia, or a very good first step, if you're trying to push a piece of content on the 10-year gilt outlook, or what's happening with the Fed, or even indicative rates, a lot of that data won't be regulated, won't have a high burden, a high regulatory burden for us as a firm before we can distribute it. But it has got greater than zero. I need to make sure that my mom isn't consuming the 10-year gilt data, or that my son isn't going to look at indicative prices and think it's a good idea to go and figure out how he can trade CFDs. Like there's a burden of protection on. He wouldn't do that. There's a burden of protection that we owe anyone consuming that data, but it can be quite basic. Just knowing that that person is a Symphony user and is been onboarded to a Symphony pod, and on the balance of probability is a firm that we can identify, and as a member of that firm is good enough to deliver certain content or give the client access to certain indicative pricing data. And so that, I think, rather than hitting a process block and leaving the kind of barrier to entry kind of too high, we can start opening up this interoperability, this kind of ecosystem, this workflow, by just doing some of this really basic identity management. And I guess that's what I'm really keen to talk to FINOS about, and if that results in extensions for FDC3, great. But I think that's going to be really powerful.
Yeah, I'm constantly trying to get my kids to stop trading CFDs. Dan, have we got a few more minutes for questions? Anyone like to ask a question of my esteemed Leslie?
So FDC3 is one of the great things about it is having consistent naming. I want to have an instrument. There's a FDC3 data context tells me what fields I can use. Fantastic. So let me ask you, should we call it, as Chris did, an application? Should we call it a component, as Matt did? Or should we call it a widget, as Nick did? Chris, what's the correct term for the thing that actually connects to the FDC3 protocol?
I'm tempted to say yes.
Our clients find it so, like, some people want to talk about widgets and we talk about apps. I would love to have one.
Yeah, well, you're nearly sitting next to Derek, who's working on making this naming even harder as we try and put widgets inside apps in FDC3. But it's
apps, right?
Yes, it's applications technically.
Matt?
There is use cases and workflows group in FDC3 that's intended for people to come and talk about their needs more. It's a fairly active community, so there are actually various people, particularly from some of the vendors, who are willing to take on doing work to add things in. One of the more difficult things has actually been to get people to come out of the woodwork and say, I need to be able to do this with them. It's being quite a technical standard as well, you may have found some of the documentation isn't that accessible because it's written like, a bit like an ISO standard or something. It's not the most accessible, but it is one of the things we're working on this year as well, is to try and make getting started with it easier, and really to focus on bringing people in to talk about what they need to do, because even if they can't come and do it with the standard, it builds the use cases for it. As long as we hear those, as long as you can share that information, there are a lot of active people in FDC3 who are willing to take it on and produce the solutions. So really, one thing we really want to do this year is bring more of the business stakeholders to come and tell us what problems they're trying to solve are, so that the engineers can then get down and actually work up some solutions for them.
I'd just like to jump in on this question as well, because working at FINOS, obviously we are trying to get the finance industry to do open source and to engage and contribute to open source. And it sounds like a non-starter, but firms like NatWest and Interop.io, and hopefully, well, we certainly have buy-side firms involved and contributing to our projects. So if any of you are working for a firm and you think, oh, we definitely can't do open source, you probably can if you put your minds to it. We're here to help. That's something we like to help people do. So if you want to engage with FDC3 or any of the other FINOS projects, then come and talk to us, because I think there are ways to get this stuff done, and it's not as impossible as maybe Nick let on there.
Well, this has already been helpful for me.
As you said at the beginning as well, it is the perfect use case for open source. It's about talking to other people. You need to be somewhere where you can arrange the conversation, as opposed to something that you do in-house, you keep in-house. It doesn't help you talk to anyone else. So I think it's one of the easiest ones to make a case for amongst open source projects.